Hello, this time on Sitrep.
3, 2, 1, ignition. And liftoff Falcon 9. Go Transporter 11.
The UK's first sovereign military spy satellite has blasted into orbit. We will talk to its manufacturer about the capability it could eventually give UK defence. But when budgets are tight, can, indeed should the UK be in the military space race? Also this week, 3 years since the Taliban takeover, we hear one Afghan commando's story of trying to fight back and eventually escaping. And the moment that ultimately made Ryan Ramsay into a submarine captain on an exchange with the US Navy.
The submarines were cool as you like, so submarines are cool, right? So I got to ride the Virginia class, which was, I count that as one of my best birthdays ever.
Sitrep with James Hurst and Professor Michael Clarke.
Submarines are cool. Rockets are also pretty cool. They're even more expensive than submarines. Mike, the UK gets its first sovereign military satellite. Is this one small step or one giant leap, do you think?
Well, it's actually quite a big leap for us. I was just thinking about it, that in the 1980s I was writing about foreign and defence policy in the Thatcher era. And at the time, I always remember the figure, space policy was allocated 100 million. Not 100 million a year, 100 million in total over how many ever years it would take. Because the view then, this was in the 1980s, was that, well, space is quite interesting and it's probably right that we have something to do with it, but it's not really an area that we can explore, still less have a sovereign capability in. And of course, since then, if there's one thing you can say about space and defence, it's that we as a society have huge vulnerabilities because of our dependence in space. So the fact that we have some sovereign capability, I think, is the beginning of a pretty long journey in terms of defence.
Well, also with us this week, Juliana, who is Research Fellow in Space Security at the defence think tank Rusi. Juliana, welcome to Sitrep. I'm guessing, as someone immersed in the world of space, you're excited by this.
Yes, this is a huge step, right? As Mike has already outlined. If we're looking at the UK space capabilities, the only sovereign capability we had before this launch was the Skynet satellite communications constellation. So, with this new launch, we're making a definitive step towards having more space capabilities that the UK can own itself.
So it is just one small piece of a big military space jigsaw planned by the Ministry of Defence. It does raise some questions about priorities and value for money spent on defence space capability in tight times, but it is now a tangible example that we have to work with. So we will discuss all that in a moment, but let's look at exactly what the Tyche satellite is and why do we want it. Former Royal Navy officer Darren Jones is head of defence business at Tyche's manufacturer, Surrey Satellite Technology.
So Tyche is an Earth observation satellite being procured by the MOD to provide intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance imagery. Tyche has a 1 meter GSD. That's a way of measuring the resolution. So it's not by any means that the highest resolution of satellite that could be procured by MOD. We have higher resolution satellites that SSTL build, but that's not really the intent of the project. So MOD has always obtained satellite imagery from other sources, from allies and from commercial providers, and it will continue to do that as part of the defence space strategy. But the aim of Project Tyche is the first of several demonstrators that are being procured under a programme called Minerva. And the aim really is to help the MOD understand how it will build its future constellation of satellites. So it'll provide imagery, it'll help them to understand how to operate the satellites, and help them to understand what types of sensors they may want to include on their satellites in the future.
So this is essentially a first step?
Yes, very much so, yes.
And you say a 1 meter GSD. Can you just explain in sort of practical terms what that means in terms of the kind of images it can give you?
So GSD is ground sampling distance. So it's one of many ways of determining the resolution or the performance of an imager. What essentially that means is that around a meter of sort of area on the Earth's surface equates to sort of a pixel within an image. So objects larger than 1 meter can be identified. Smaller than that, it's just a pixel.
This has evolved from civilian satellites that you've previously launched. How different is it from those, or is it simply that it is owned by the Ministry of Defence?
Broadly speaking, it's very similar. Tyche is a variant of our Carbonite class of spacecraft, and we built several of those for customers around the world. Different sensors, so some have visible waveband images, some have infrared images, some have radar sensors. So it's broadly the same. It has the same core avionics, has the same propulsion system, the same power system, etc. Tyche is a little bit different from some of the satellites we built in the past. One way it's different, it has an onboard processing capability. So what that means is you can upload algorithms to the spacecraft, and it can do some onboard processing of imagery before it comes down to the ground. And the other difference is that we've built in an inter-satellite link into this spacecraft, which means it can send data via something called a BGAN link to another satellite and down to the ground, which means we can communicate with the satellite and we can receive imagery or data from the satellite when it's not over one of our ground stations.
So what is the long-term plan here? Because we've said this is a first step. Given the UK can already get imagery and does get imagery from allies and from other satellites, why would the UK want to build its own constellation?
Well, you're right. MOD can procure and gain imagery from other sources. But I guess most of your listeners will know that there are lots of occasions where the armed forces will want to contract out services to civilian providers, but there are lots of occasions where it can't do that, and it needs to have complete control over a particular bit of equipment. In this case, having sovereign capability, having its own satellites, means that MOD has full access to all of the data. It can task the satellite exactly how it wants to, and it can be fully assured of the imagery it's gaining from it.
So how controllable is Tyche? If you want to get some imagery of a particular place on the Earth's surface, do you have to wait until it next flies over, or can it be controlled to get that image here and now?
No, so you're right. One of the downsides to satellites is that they're in a fixed orbit. We do have a propulsion system. We can make small changes, but essentially it's in a fixed orbit. So it's at any point it's imaging over the area of Earth that sort of is below it. We have the ability to move the satellite a little bit, to point it in different directions, but essentially it's pointing down on the area of the Earth that's sort of directly below. So what that means is that you have to wait for the satellite to pass over a particular area before you can image. And that's why the MOD will always have a requirement for airborne assets for ISR, because they have the clear benefit that they're very manoeuvrable, and you can task them as long as you're operating within a particular area of a base or a ship, then you can have the ability to send them where you want. But clearly there are limitations to airborne assets in that they have a fixed range. They're limited by airspace restrictions, and you may not have a base located in the area of the world where you want to take the imagery. And that's really where satellites come in, because they really have no restrictions in terms of where they can image on the Earth. The only restrictions being things like cloud cover, for example, for an optical imaging satellite, but that can be overcome with radar sensors and alternative sensors on a satellite.
Darren Jones, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now, before we discuss costs and value for money, it's probably worth just putting some context on this. The reported cost of the satellite itself is £22 million, which, both in defence terms and space terms, is a drop in the ocean. Juliana, do you have any idea of the launch cost? Because I was looking at the SpaceX website. I mean, they talk about rideshare for a small satellite like this for as little as $1 million.
Yes, I think at the moment Falcon 9 is the sort of cheapest launch option there is, and that obviously does still include, having to get the satellite over to the States. But at the moment it does still seem to be the sort of cheapest option, partly because obviously Falcon 9s do, we see launches almost every week.
But this is incredibly cheap from what I can see.
Yes, I mean, you've seen launch costs coming down significantly over the last 20 years or so. So, it's become a lot cheaper already to launch into space. That being said, we are looking at a sort of relatively cheap cost to get a satellite into space right now.
I mean, Mike, this is the first step in the Astari program, as we were discussing with Darren there. The overall budget, because we're looking at eventually a constellation, is almost £1 billion to deliver around 2030. To you, does that look like value for money for the UK?
Well, it does if you think about what we'll spend on defence between now and 2030, with a defence budget of, between sort of $55-60 billion a year. Between now and 2030, and $1 billion will be spent in this sort of area. The question is, where's the marginal value? And of course, you don't know that because this is a capability for defence. And as Juliana said, I mean, there are cheaper ways, or there are cheaper providers. But the fact is, it's a bit like intelligence, that 95% of all intelligence you can get is from open sources. But the 5% you can't get, that's gold dust. And when you need it, nothing else will do. And in a way, this is the case with sovereign capability, that you may be able to do this thing more cheaply using the market, which has expanded terrifically in the last 10 years. But where you need a very specific defence requirement, nothing else will do on those occasions when you need it. And are we likely to come up against those occasions in the next 10 to 20 years? You bet your life we are, because of the way the world is. And so the value for money question will be judged in a way by the marginal advantages it gives you when you really need those marginal advantages.
This question of sovereign capability, as Darren mentioned, and he knows it from his own military career, we get plenty of imagery and we can commission plenty of imagery, not just from the commercial market, but also from allies. There are some who look at the UK, entering a military space race as they see it, and seeing it as about ego rather than being about actual need. Do you see a genuine need for sovereign capability?
I mean, let's be clear, we need space. And space is not a defense luxury, it's part of the defense baseline, right? If we can't see through space, if we can't hear through space, we'll be much worse off. And we are, as we already discussed, incredibly dependent on space, obviously for civil purposes, but also increasingly so for the military. Now, when it comes to what do we need to own on a sovereign level versus, what can we sort of buy in? I think ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance is an interesting example here, because on plenty of occasions that, as Darren has already pointed out, we will be able to buy this in from commercial providers, work with allies, but there will also be instances where we do need that information much faster, and where we may not be able to share that information with commercial providers. And it's exactly those sort of short-term taskings of a certain area that will be important, specifically also if we want to revisit that area multiple times and be able to see certain, areas of progress, for example, if we want to see whether infrastructures are being built, for example. And if we're talking about an asset in low Earth orbit specifically, we're talking about a revisit rate of about every 90 minutes or so. So that allows us to sort of really do see changes on the ground quite quickly.
Mike, this is about getting information to troops on the ground or at sea or in the air, isn't it?
Yes, and that's the point, that it may be, as Juliana said, it may be that you can't get that commercially and you have to have your own satellites to do it. And anyone in the military will tell you that you cannot predict 2 years out where your military might be, particularly in naval affairs. And so the ability to launch in a particular way across a particular orbit and to revisit that orbit or come around every 90 minutes could be critical.
We have, though, at the moment, the rumour mill rolling because we've got spending review, defence review underway. Mike, you and I both know what happens in these periods. There is briefing, there is counter-briefing in the media. People are trying to influence things. So we should put a huge health warning on any suggestions that people know what is coming. But the Telegraph is claiming that the spy satellite project Minerva is under threat.
It may be, but if it's under threat, it will be under threat of delay, certainly not cancellation. It may be that the MOD is going to have to delay a certain number of programmes because of the short-term squeeze which we're all expecting in the autumn budget. And of course, the problem with delay is not just the delay it entails, but the fact that the costs then go up because of the delay, and that's got to be factored into the decision. But yes, if it is under threat, it is a threat of delay, and I think that's plausible given what we know is happening elsewhere in the defence budget.
I just wanted to finish with some context. I mean, firstly, your thoughts on whether we can, in your view, afford to delay it, but also the one thing we've not talked about is where we sit in the league table of the space race. You know, we know the big players like the US, Russia, and China. Are we well behind a lot of other nations in terms of getting our own defence space capability?
I think it's interesting to sort of look at, who are we comparing ourselves to? And obviously any comparison with the US or, China or Russia on this is, we're going to look at sort of much smaller in comparison. But I think if we're looking across Europe specifically, I think the UK is in a very similar position to a lot of other European countries. Of course, the UK is at a sort of disadvantage in the sense that it left the EU and therefore no longer has access to the Galileo program, for example, which is the EU's answer to GPS. So that is gone. It does still have access to Copernicus, which is the EU's Earth observation constellation. So there is that asset that can still be made use of. I think also within NATO, again, I don't think the UK is sort of unique in its current position. That being said, I don't think that means we should rest on laurels. I think that means, we need to further invest. Again, SATCOM, we are pretty much covered through Skynet. PNT currently entirely reliant on GPS. And for ISR, obviously, building out Istari and the constellation that is sort of meant to give us a better intelligence picture. So I think in terms of delays, are we able to afford those? I mean, ideally not, no, because again, we're currently reliant on either the US, Copernicus, or commercial partners. Then again, I think it's better to sort of go on with the project as intended rather than rush into things.
It's a balancing act always, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a balance must be struck there. Again, delays are obviously, not ideal, far from ideal, but space projects do take time.
Juliana Suess, thank you so much. Good to see you on Sitrep.
Thank you.
Well, let's come back down to Earth and look a little back, cast your mind back to 3 years ago when Britain's armed forces were in a race against time in Afghanistan. Operation Pitting evacuated 15,000 people from Kabul, UK nationals, interpreters, and other Afghans who had worked for our government. But there was no evacuation for many tens of thousands of sworn enemies of the Taliban. Afghans who had served their country in the Republic's armed forces, people who often fought alongside British and other NATO troops. In the last 3 years, some of those Afghan veterans have been killed, many others have gone into hiding, some, though, have managed to escape. The Afghan author and poet Bashir Sakowaz has just written the English language memoir of a former commando. Amir is Bashir's cousin's son. Now, as the country fell province by province, Amir was in Helmand and surrounded by the Taliban. He managed to evade them, though, and talked his way into Iran, from where he flew back to the Afghan capital, arriving the very day that it fell.
He went somewhere in hiding in Kabul, and one of their major commanders contacted him and said, we continue fighting against the Taliban, and weapons were gathered, and also the food. But they had to go to the mountain in the north, a place called Salang. There were only 22 people. Their main commander said there's a chance that we will have more people. And they continued fighting there for 4 months when the snow was falling and very harsh, not having any accommodation. They continued fighting. But then they were ambushed by the Taliban, and 21 of them were killed. Amir managed to escape, disguising himself as a civilian, and came to Kabul. And from there, then he escaped to come to Iran.
How did he manage to get out to Iran?
That by itself is very complicated. He took a bus with another two commandos. On the way, one of them decided not to take that bus. Amir also got out of the bus somewhere else, but one of the unfortunate one whose brother had a house in Iran and he was going to give accommodation to the other two guys was captured in Herat. And there he was killed immediately. So the option of going Iran for a while became impossible. But then pretending that he's civilian, and also because he had contacts in Iran, he managed to escape from Afghanistan to Iran. At that time, the Taliban were not fully in control of the whole Afghanistan, and the borders were not sealed. And that's how it happened. But of course, today it would be impossible.
So 3 years on, Amir is living in Iran. Is he safe there?
That's the main issue, and I actually asked the British government to help Amir to come to England. He's not safe because the Iranians are unhappy with Afghan refugees coming to Iran since the Taliban took control. There's a huge unemployment, and Iranian government pushes these people to go back to Afghanistan. For civilians, they have a chance to live, but somebody with a track record of fighting the Taliban, Amir would be prosecuted, and I'm sure he would be killed if he was caught to go to Afghanistan. He is working as a construction worker, but every day with lots of fear that one day the Iranian police will catch him and will send him back to Afghanistan.
Amir got out. What about the tens, hundreds of thousands of others who served in Afghanistan's armed forces?
They faced tragedy. The Taliban lied like before that they would forgive all those people who were fighting against them, the Afghan army. But as soon as they managed to control Afghanistan and there was no resistance against them, they caught these people in different parts, and either they put them in prison, or to make it cheaper because prisons are full, they kill them on the spot. Even until now, when they find somebody who's hiding, they catch him and kill him. So they say that they will give the same job to these army people joining the Taliban army, but that was a lie, and they get killed.
3 years on from the return of the Taliban to power, what are Amir's thoughts? You're still in regular contact with him. What does he feel for the future of Afghanistan and himself?
While I am pessimistic, thinking that this time the Taliban will stay forever, Amir thinks there would be a chance that he would go back and fight the Taliban again, because there is some kind of resistance outside Afghanistan. Political leaders gather and they talk about peace or fighting the Taliban. So Amir thinks of that.
And what about you 3 years on? You live in the UK, but how are you feeling about what has happened to the country where you were born?
I really feel very sorry. When I went to Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban in 2001, I predicted that the people were so tired that there would be no war. And of course, I misjudged it, and the Taliban slowly became powerful. So what really hurts me, the Taliban decided to close girls' school, not allowing women to work. Basically, there's complete hunger and poverty. I feel very, very sad, and I don't think that there's a solution for unless the international community put pressure on Taliban to at least give the woman a chance to work and go to school. They even stopped pension scheme in Afghanistan, saying it is un-Islamic. So you can imagine there's no music. They are burning the musical instrument. They are actually even closing the parks. So people should not enjoy life there.
Bashir Sakharaz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And Bashir's book, telling Amir's story, it's called Fighting the Taliban. It's out at the end of September. 3 years ago, the Afghan armed forces, as the Republic fell, had hundreds of thousands of personnel. It was never going to be realistic to evacuate them all, but it is heartbreaking to hear what it's done to their lives, Mike.
Yes, and it goes back to what a dreadful deal it was that, President Trump, when he was president in 2019, 2020, essentially created this we're getting out whatever arrangement. President Biden made it worse by making it very, very precipitate. And so the withdrawal was chaotic, and that demolished any attempt to create an integrated solution. I mean, the ANA, the Afghan National Army, of course, they were not going to be evacuated. There's, we're talking about 200,000 or 300,000 people, but they were never given the chance to integrate into a new Afghanistan that would be some sort of power sharing arrangement in which the Taliban would play a part, but only a part. Now, that was supposed to be the nature of a deal, but of course, the West was never, under American leadership, never made that deal because Trump essentially said he did a deal, but he didn't. He just sort of said, we're getting out and that's it. So that possibility of reintegrating the ANA under a new arrangement was never there. And the result of that, as you say, has been absolutely tragic.
I mean, we heard there that Amir still hopes the Taliban's reign could at some point be brought to an end. That's a hope that Bashir doesn't think is realistic. Has anything dented the Taliban grip on power since they returned in August 2021?
Not so far. What is almost certain to happen is that Taliban power within society will become more solid, and the Taliban will be a client of Pakistan and then China. I mean, the great strategic winner from this awful period of Afghans' recent history is China, and they will end up dominating Afghanistan, and they certainly won't care that the Taliban are a ruthless theocratic dictatorship. That's what they are, and they're becoming more ruthless. Interestingly, I was speaking with a very professional, well-educated Afghan woman quite recently who had been living in Britain for a while and had a very good job, and her family were doing pretty well. And she was telling me that her cousins and all of the younger people, women that she still knew in Afghanistan, had all their education was completely cut off. They simply couldn't carry on with a professional education. And she told me that all of them are looking for husbands on dating sites as far as they can get them. They're trying to establish relationships with German and Swedish men in order to get married so they can move out and continue their education. And when that's the way that young women in Afghanistan are reduced to having to think, then there's something deeply wrong with what's happening in the society.
And of course, it could shape the future of the society. I suppose if we learn anything from the events of August 2021, it is that things can change in an instant, and those kind of changes can change a society forever.
They can, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I think we should acknowledge is that what is popular in Afghanistan is the fact that there is peace. There is no war. There isn't bombing. There isn't fighting. And that is popular. A lot of Afghans say, well, at least now we live in a more peaceful society. And the Taliban are unpleasant, and we don't like them, and we don't like living in the way that they want us to live, but at least there aren't bombs going off. And I think we ought to acknowledge that is a source of legitimacy for the Taliban, at least for a while, But in 5 more years, in 10 more years, that sense of sheer repression, theocratic dictatorship, you wonder how far that can be driven in a big society, a lot of 25 million people in a potentially rich country, potentially rich, with a population that are very inventive and they want a better life. And the Taliban certainly won't give it to them.
Finally, this week's moment that made me, and we're going to go deep under the ocean with Ryan Ramsay. He's former captain of the Royal Navy submarine HMS Turbulent. Now, he's spoken to us before on Sitrep about perilous moments during that command while training future submarine captains. But the moment that made Ryan came before all that in 2005, 14 years into his Royal Navy career, at a time when he felt he may have hit the buffers.
I was a submarine warfare officer. I'd completed the submarine command course and been second in command of a submarine already. At that particular time, obviously, I was eager to be captain as soon as I could, and there were obviously steps to get there. But there's a bit of losing direction as to whether this was actually going to happen or whether it wasn't going to happen, and possibly some frustration that went with that. So I went out on exchange to the United States Navy to an organisation called Devron 12, which sounds like word lettuce, but it's actually it's a submarine squadron that was responsible for development. The guy who was leading it, a guy called John Richardson, who went on to be chief of naval operations under Barack Obama and also under Trump, was the leader at the time. And what he did for me, in one moment actually, when I think about it, just before my birthday in 2005, was take me on the newest submarine in the world to do its qualification, but also allowed me to express my own views about what I thought they could do better, and enabled them to receive that information effectively. And within that one seminal moment for me, what he'd done was change everything. He'd enabled me to communicate effectively with a totally different Navy and an operating pattern, and have that information received effectively, such that they took action on what I'd observed and respected that opinion.
And were you simply observing that certification? Were you taking part? Were you playing a key role?
Well, that was it. So I thought I was there just observing, and then within 24 hours, I was taking a key role, and John Richardson made that happen. And what that did for me really quickly after that particular one was I was riding lots of submarines. For example, for the submarine command course in the US, I rode 5 of those. Suddenly, he enabled me to become a subject matter expert very, very quickly in warfighting for the US Navy. And that helped me massively with my onward career.
So when you're on each of those submarines taking part in that process, what are you actually doing? And is this a process that you had played any comparable part in the UK by that point?
So I had in the UK actually. So I was a sea trainer. I worked for Flag Officer Sea Training, and I was what was called a command rider there. But this was a totally different experience to having done it in the UK. So recognised as a UK subject matter expert in navigation, warfighting, those type of disciplines. But this was subliminally different, and predominantly because you're operating in a totally different environment with people and organizations you don't know and systems you don't know. And yet what it forced me to do was to observe raw skills and comment on those. Because, for example, I couldn't comment on US tactics and say those tactics could be better, but I could comment on leadership, and I could comment on followership and teamwork. And it made me hone in really quickly on what are the important things that I can add value to here, and how can I help this team improve in decision making, in taking risk, in leading their team members, and supporting and mentoring, and all those type of different things. So it changed my perspective away from the tactics that I'd always focused on into the people, the leadership, the followership, and focus on that instead.
What was it like being on those submarines? How different were they to the subs that you were used to from the UK?
Yeah, well, so I have this view that I was fortunate enough to serve with the Royal Netherlands Navy in the 90s. I was the first exchange officer, so I got to see another way of doing something way before I'd reached the US. And in the US, I went on a total of 15 different submarines and some operations, some exercises. So I got to see so many different leadership styles. I got to see tactics done differently. And I think when I went out to the US, I was under the presumption that the UK were really good at this and the US very they had all the submarines, but they were very procedural and did it. And what I'd left with was actually we do things in different ways and we still achieve the same aim, and neither is right or wrong. And the British way is not always the right way, and the US way is sometimes the right way. And so I left a much broader person for having experienced that. And all of the stuff that I'd observed, I brought into my own time on HMS Turbulence. So, for example, looking after families, the US is so good at this. They're so good at it. And yet the UK are not. The UK, and they still haven't, we still haven't got better. But I could pull some of those things and say, for HMS Turbulent, we are going to be really good at how we look after our families, and this is how we're going to do it. And it's not, I've thought up something new. I've just lifted it from what I've seen the US do.
You mentioned, I think, was it 15 submarines you got
Yes.
on in the US? I mean, physically, what were those submarines like? And for someone who spent their career on submarines, what was it like to see that different range of boats?
Well, I have to say that the submarines were cool as you like. So submarines are cool, right? So I got to ride the Virginia class, which was, I count that as one of my best birthdays ever. When I was on the newest submarine in the world, I got off the newest submarine in the world in Port Canaveral because we had some time to kill. They gave us a personal tour around Cape Canaveral, some places that people don't go to. And then I flew back to be with my family, and all in one day. And I said that was just an awesome day. But then equally, I've ridden the Seawolf and I've ridden the 688s, and they always amaze me. The technology was incredible. Fast submarines, absolute committed crews to what they're doing. And probably the one variance I would say is that how the submarine operated was generally dominated by the type of leadership style. And sometimes there were good leaders, and sometimes there were leaders that were not so good. And that showed very much in how the crew operated. And that's exactly the same as the UK. It's exactly the same in any organization. The businesses I've worked in since I've left the military, there are good, well-led businesses and there are very poorly led businesses, but leadership ends up being the key to everything.
For those of us who haven't spent time on submarines, even if we think they are cool, how different physically are those? Because in my head, it's kind of like, well, how different can a metal tube underwater be? But I guess it could be much huger or much smaller, or actually, are they all limited to being roughly the same inside?
No, they are very different. I mean, the size of the submarine determines what's in it. But there's a tendency for all submarine operating nations to fill whatever that tube is with as much kit as possible. The American submarines, lots of weapons, some of the best sonar equipment you've seen. And the UK is comparable with the Astute class, effectively, is as good as. And so what I saw, it had a very Spartan feel to it. So on a UK submarine, it's still Spartan, but actually there's some niceties in there, and the officers' mess looks good, and the senior eight's mess looks good. Whereas this was they were all very Spartan. They were machines built for war, not for comfort.
So you get this experience. You've already done the exchange with the Dutch Navy. You go to the US. You find yourself given this opportunity to observe all different kinds of leadership, and then you come back to the UK. How different were you when you came back from that experience in the US?
I think I was very different, and it was. I've described the seminal moment that changed, but actually, what John Richardson did for me over the next year and a half was coach and mentor me, and put me on programs that I would never ever have got access to, like going to the Naval War College and studying strategic studies and a variety of other subjects. So what he did very cleverly was, I was doing my day job and learning all this stuff and giving back to the US Navy, but he was basically giving me all the tools that I would need for command when I got back without me realizing that was happening. And then I got selected to go to the Advanced Command and Staff course and do my Masters in Defence Studies. And predominantly that was all down to him. He was the man that pushed in my reports for me to go off and do that course. I was selected, and I was selected for command as well. So I see he in his head, and we've talked about this since. So when he finished being chief of naval operations, we got back in touch, and we had discussed this, and that was his plan. He saw something in me that maybe others didn't, maybe I didn't, but he saw something that he said, right, I can invest in this, and I'm going to make sure that I give Ryan everything I can to make sure he's prepared and succeed in command, which is what I did.
Ryan, it's a quite a remarkable story. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
You're welcome.
It is such a pleasure to talk to somebody with such enthusiasm for submarines. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard submarines described as cool before, although actually my one brief visit to a submarine, they are pretty cool, aren't they, Mike?
They certainly are, yeah. I was, years ago, I was on the USS Baton Rouge, which was an LA class, Los Angeles class attack submarine in the States. And yeah, they're very cool. And the Baton Rouge was decommissioned in the more than 20 years ago, in the late 1990s, I think. But thankfully, I still have the baseball cap. Very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Prove you were there. I mean, one of the things that I think comes across from Ryan's story there is the value of, this was an adventure for him. It was very much a working adventure, but that new experience, that different experience enabled him to bring something different back from an allied country.
Yeah, it's really important, this idea of mutual learning, and the Americans are very good at this. I mean, they're very good at accepting people to learn from them, and also to offer ideas, and also coming to our sort of courses and operational backgrounds and operational bases, and offer something there as well. The Americans are really good at this. Well, we do it with other nations as well. And this is one of the biggest attributes of NATO, this ability institutionally to go through a mutual learning process and looking for best practice. And I mean, most military personnel, although all militaries are very structured and they have their own cultures, individuals in the military, officers, are pretty good at being open-minded, at looking at each other's systems and trying to work out what they could adopt from them and so on. And I call it's the hidden gold dust of NATO. This ability to learn from each other, the hidden gold dust of the most impressive alliance the world has ever seen.
Mike, thank you. Good to see you once again. Thank you to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke will be rejoined by Kate Chabot for another Sitrep next Thursday, while I sit quietly in the editor's chair. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website. That's forcesnews.com. For now, from me, James Hurst, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.